Have you ever been scrolling online and just stopped, totally confused, because you saw people who called themselves feminists agreeing with the far right on something like trans rights? It's a lot to get your head around. Well, today we're going to try and unpack exactly what's going on using a really interesting framework from two scholars, Serena Bassi and Greta LaFleur. So let's just dive right in.
So, here's our roadmap. We'll start with that confusing alliance that has so many of us scratching our heads. Then, we're going to get really clear on who the key players are and what they're actually arguing. From there, we'll dig into the main theory of this whole thing, post-fascist feminism, to connect the dots. We'll even take a look at feminism's own messy, complicated history. And we'll wrap up with what the authors say is really at stake, a fight for the very definition of the words we use every day.
All right, let's kick things off with the central puzzle, right? This really strange political crossover that seems to be happening more and more around the issue of trans rights.
I mean, on the face of it, it sounds totally impossible, doesn't it? How could some feminists find themselves using the same talking points as the far right? Well, the authors of this work argued that our usual way of looking at things, progressive versus conservative, it just doesn't really capture the whole picture here. It's way more complicated than that.
And here's where you can really see it. It's like two different streams flowing into the exact same river. On one side, you've got the gender-critical argument, which is all framed around protecting women's safety. But on the other side, you have a classic conservative argument, which is rooted in this idea that your sex is biological, it's set in stone at birth, and that's that. Now, the authors point out that even though these ideas come from totally different worldviews, they both end up at the exact same conclusion, creating this really confusing political overlap.
Okay, so to really get this, we've got to be super clear about who we're actually talking about. The authors are really specific with their terms, so let's break down the key groups involved in this whole debate.
First, there's the term TERFism. It stands for Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminism. And the core argument of this movement is that trans womanhood isn't, real. They see it as a kind of patriarchal strategy, like a Trojan horse, designed to get into women's spaces and weaken the feminist movement from the inside out.
And then you have something bigger, the anti-gender movement. This is a much broader coalition. It's not just focused on trans rights. It also goes after things like reproductive freedom. And you'll notice their language often has this kind of conspiratorial feel to it. They talk about something called gender theory, as if it's this dangerous idea being pushed by corrupt elites onto, normal families. So now we know who the players are. The next question is, how do they argue their case? Well, the authors say they share a really powerful communication strategy, and it all comes down to what they call the rhetoric of endangerment.
If you look at their shared playbook, it really centers on one powerful emotion, fear. Trans people are often framed as a physical threat. The whole concept of gender is painted as this dangerous, foreign idea that's attacking some kind of pure, authentic womanhood. The goal is to make cis women feel like they are constantly vulnerable. And what's really interesting is that instead of just outright attacks, they often use a strategy the authors call insidious concern, phrasing their arguments as, we're just worried about the safety of women and kids.
Okay, and this all leads us to the heart of the analysis. This is the main tool the authors use to connect all of these different threads. They call it post-fascist feminism.
Now, this is a really, really important point. When the authors use the word post-fascism, they are not calling these people fascists. That's not what they mean. They're talking about a political style. It's a style where old fears and themes from historical fascism get recycled and blended with our modern culture of neoliberalism, which is all about focusing on yourself and managing your own personal risk.
So here's how they say the formula works. Step 1. You take a historical fascist idea, like the crisis woman, this figure who was supposed to represent society decaying and gender roles falling apart. Step 2. You mix that with a very modern, neoliberal idea that big social problems are really just issues of individual risk. And what do you get? A post-fascist argument. Suddenly, trans women aren't a political group. They're framed as an individualized safety risk to real women. It's old fears in brand new packaging.
Now, I bet at this point a big question is popping into your head. Wait a minute. Can any of this really be called feminism at all? It's a fair question, and the authors tackle it directly.
And this is really the challenging part, isn't it? If a movement is actively excluding a group of women and seems to be aligning with the far right, in what sense can we still call it feminism?
Well, the author's answer is a firm yes. And for a lot of people, that's a really uncomfortable answer. They basically argue that to say this isn't a form of feminism is to ignore history. It's to pretend that the feminist movement has always been this pure, perfect force for good.
And here's why they say that. They remind us of some really difficult truths about the movement's history. There have been white supremacist feminisms that actually promoted eugenics. There have been imperialist feminisms that were all about saving women in other cultures. And of course, there have been feminist movements that actively shut out women of color and working-class women. Their point is that exclusion, unfortunately, isn't some new thing in feminism. It's been part of its long, messy, complicated story.
So, if we accept their argument that this is a form of feminism, what's the ultimate goal? What are the stakes here? The authors say it's way bigger than just a debate over policy. It's actually a fight over meaning itself.
And to make this point, they bring up this really fascinating example from the early 2000s. The Vatican didn't just disagree with concepts like gender. It literally declared what it called a semantic battle, a war over words. They even published a whole dictionary trying to redefine the terms.
And that, according to Bassi and LaFleur, is the real endgame we're seeing today. This isn't just about bathrooms or sports teams. This is a battle to control our entire political vocabulary. It's an attempt to redefine the most fundamental words that structure our society, words like woman, gender, and even feminism itself, to lock in one specific, narrow worldview.
And so this whole analysis leaves us with a pretty heavy final question. What happens when the fight for political power stops being just about winning an election and starts being about winning the dictionary? It's a lot to think about. Thanks for tuning in.